going to talk about something related but somewhat different. I think it's important to realize that these concepts are different. This is looking at secrecy regarding sex with men. And we actually had a number of questions that looked at this. I took two and combined them. So one asked literally, how important is it for you to keep your sexual activity with other men a secret? And the other was, who have you told that you've had sex with other men? And so people who either said they had told no one, or those who said it was very or somewhat important to keep this a secret about themselves, we consider to have high levels of secrecy. Or no, who said it was very important to keep it a secret, we said had high levels of secrecy, which was actually a fairly large proportion of our population, 45%. And we found here, we did find an association, so not necessarily with identity, but with this either behavior or attitude that says secrecy around this part of their lives is important. So those people who have high levels of secrecy were much more likely to report symptoms of distress. And these patterns, you'll notice in all the slides, it doesn't matter if we're talking about depression or anxiety, somatization, the patterns are kind of similar in terms of the associations. And we also found that secrecy was associated with increased homophobia, internalized homophobia, and reduced self-esteem. Finally, I wanted to talk about racism. And specifically, I look at two different aspects of racism. One is racism-related stress. So how much does the individual themselves feel that racism has bothered them or caused them stress? And then the second is a scale, or I might have them in the opposite order, but the other is a scale looking at actual recent experiences of racism. So good, I have them in the right order. So we literally asked the question, how much stress has racism caused you over the past 12 months? And you can see this wide distribution of responses. A third said not at all, 30% said a little, and then we had about a third who said anywhere from somewhat to extremely. Racism had caused them a lot of stress over the prior year. However, you can see these very strong associations when we look at that racism-related stress and actual distress symptoms in this study population. So when you go from all the way to your left, from none to extremely, you see this huge increase, very strong dose response across the different types of psychological distress symptoms, this very strong association across the board. The other thing that I found very striking was that, well, it's more striking in the next one, that the lowest level of racism-related stress was actually associated with lower internalized homophobia and higher self-esteem. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the next slide because the association in that case is actually more striking. So this next measure looks at actual experiences of racism over the last 12 months, and this comes from both questions actually come from the RAIL scale, which was developed by Shelley Harrell at Pepperdine University. And so they ask things about like being told an insulting joke, being followed in a store, being asked to represent your whole race, being minimized, those types of experiences of racism that some of us experience. Here's the distribution. It was a scale from 0 to 100, depending on to what degree people agreed with statements about experiencing those events or not. Again, you see this very strong association. People who had more of these events, who experienced more of them in the prior year, were much more likely to experience distress symptoms, regardless of the type of distress. But the other striking thing for me in this was that when we looked at racism, we actually saw that the people who experienced more racism actually also said they had experienced increased homophobia and decreased self-esteem. So, and this is internalized homophobia. This isn't experienced homophobia from other people, it's internalized homophobia. But it sort of led me to think more about the fact that for many of the people in our population, especially people will often say to us in one way or another, kind of being black is enough, being a black man is enough. And so wanting to admit or take on this other minority identity isn't always something I want to sign up for. And here was a place where I felt like that was sort of validated within our data, because the people who saw more racism in their lives had more negative feelings about bisexuality or homosexuality. I said just homosexuality here, but both were addressed in the scale. So in summary, and I realize I'm probably getting over my time, on average, these men reported, and so this is where the resiliency comes up. When we look at these scales, The scale for symptoms of distress actually goes from 0 to 4. And so you'll notice that in all my graphs, they only go from 0 to 1 or 0 to 1.2, because on average, that's where people's mean scores were. So even though people had a lot going on in their lives, many were not working, many had unstable living situations, et cetera, they weren't actually talking about huge levels of psychological distress. When we look at self-esteem, the self-esteem scores are actually quite high as well. So is the Black Pride scores. The scale goes from, I think it's from 11 to 45, so we're up here around 40. So people actually, in many ways, despite these multiple stressors and challenges they're experiencing, are in normal ranges or fairly good ranges in terms of their psychosocial and mental health outcomes. We found that in general, things like self-esteem, racial pride, and internalized homophobia are actually largely unassociated with just the socio-demographic measures, where we do find that some of the associations I'm going to talk about in the next slide. But we find that lower education and unstable housing are associated with increased distress, that secrecy, not necessarily how one identifies, but their need or desire to keep their sexual activity with other men secret, is positively associated with distress and negatively associated with self-esteem. It's also associated with internalized homophobia, as is self-identification as heterosexual, or in some cases even bisexual. And finally, and I think these are where we actually saw the strongest associations in the data, was that racism-related stress and experiences of racism were strongly associated with psychological distress, and that important associations were also observed with internalized homophobia and with reduced self-esteem. And so we need to keep these in mind. I mean, I think a lot of us have talked about racism in this discussion, but we haven't always had a lot of data to present on it. So hopefully this is something to contribute to today. Of course, our data have a lot of limitations. The sample was not random. All the data were self-reported. And men under 30 years of age and those of higher socioeconomic status are underreported. Dr. Shapta talked about that quite a bit, and it's a challenge that we're finding in many studies to get both younger people and working men, higher SES men to take part in this type of research.